by that. So, there we go. Now we're recording it. So, okay. Chad Dibble.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chad Dibble, Deputy Director of the Ecosystem Conservation Division at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Let's see, my role relates to the Delta in many ways. I oversee the Watershed Restoration Grants Branch, which administers grant funds from many of the proposition and bond funds that we have dedicated to restoration across the state and in the Delta. I oversee the Habitat Conservation Planning Branch, which is in charge of all of our environmental permitting across the state, including in the Delta. And I oversee the water branch that is heavily involved in regulating implementation of the State Water Project ITP. However, primarily, most of the work that happens with us in the Delta is housed in our Region 3 office, our Bay Delta region. So most of you are probably familiar with working with those staff, but I oversee all the headquarter functions and the branches that kind of control most of those areas across the state and work with our regions to implement those different programs. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Chad. Wasong Jin.
I'm Wasong Jin at the State Water Board. I'm at the Bay Delta section, as Diane Riddle just explained about the role of the State Water Board in terms of the protection of beneficial use, including protection of fish and wildlife. And that also interested in the ecosystem restoration in the Delta. And I have a background in aquatic ecology and aquatic ecosystem restoration. My scientific nature and scientific interest to be part of this group.
Great, thanks, Wasong. And Bill Harrell.
Hi, I'm Bill Harrell. Good afternoon, everybody. I lead the Eco Restore program for California Department of Water Resources. We are still hard at work trying to accelerate our Eco Restore projects within DWR and outside DWR. It's been about 6 years for the program now, and we're approaching our 30,000 acre goal in planning or construction or completed projects, and we're looking to the future to continue that type of work. Good to be here.
Great. Thanks for being here, Bill. Rachel Wigginton.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Wigginton. I'm a senior environmental scientist at the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy, working with Campbell, and we work in restoration in the Delta in a couple different ways, but the main one being funding restoration projects through our Prop 1 program, and working collaboratively with our colleagues at the Stewardship Council on this subcommittee.
Thanks, Rachel. Dan Constable.
Hey everyone, apologies, my camera's off this afternoon. My name is Dan Constable. I work as an environmental program manager at the Delta Stewardship Council, and I'm helping support the updated revision to proposed update to Chapter 4 of the Delta Plan, also known as the Ecosystem Amendment, and some work under restoration planning under our climate change initiative that we call Delta Adapts.
Thanks, Dan. Dylan Chapple.
Yeah, hi, Dylan Chapple. In the Delta Science program at the Delta Stewardship Council, work on a variety of things related to restoration. You'll hear more about that today, and particularly with supporting adaptive management from the project level to kind of the system level, touching all those pieces.
Thanks, Dylan. And Chris Klyer.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Chris Klyer. I'm an executive fellow at the Delta Stewardship Council, and I'm working with Amanda to help plan and coordinate this restoration subcommittee, as well as DPIIC initiatives in general.
Great, thanks, Chris. And then finally, Brandon Chapin. Brandon, do you want to say hi to everybody behind the?
Sorry, everyone. Hi, this is Brandon Chapin, Delta Stewardship Council. I just want to remind everyone, if there's any issues with the Zoom or phone calls or anything, feel free to email me at engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Brandon. And I think that's everybody I see on my screen for introductions. So Jeff and Campbell, I think we're ready for the next item.
I think you actually may have missed me.
Oh gosh, Jeff.
Which is
I
okay.
did.
Which is
Oh,
okay.
sorry.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Henderson. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer for Planning at the Delta Stewardship Council. And pleased to be working with all of you and sort of co-chairing this group along with Campbell. Happy to move into our presentation if that works for everybody. So Brandon, if we can bring that up.
Jeff, sorry, just 1 second. I just moved over Cynthia Joe Fowler too.
Oh,
Oh, thanks. Yeah, Cynthia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, sorry, I'm learning Zoom. We don't use that at the Corps of Engineers, so it's a little new. Hi, I'm Cynthia Joe Fowler, and I am with the South Pacific Division of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in San Francisco. I'm somewhat new with the SPD, and I was just put on this team, so I'm really happy to be working with you. And I'll be kind of looking at this through the lens of a lot of the restoration work that the Sacramento district has to do under a lot of their large projects. Over.
great. Okay, thank you. So Brandon, let's go ahead and pull up that presentation. And why don't we advance a couple of slides? All right, great. Thank you, everybody. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk a bit about the purpose and the structure of why we're here, why this subcommittee has been formed, as well as thinking through some initial thoughts that we've had on staffing and approach to the subcommittee. And then after that, Campbell will walk us through some initial thoughts that we've had on a work plan for the group and a timeline for our next steps. Next slide, please. So to implement restoration at the pace and the scale that are necessary to meet the goals that are set out in the proposed revisions to the Delta Plan Ecosystem Amendment, and to implement the Water Resilience Portfolio, the Cutting Green Tape Initiative, and the Governor's California Biodiversity Initiative, it's clear that we must better coordinate our various ecosystem restoration plans and actions among each other, as well as with stakeholders, and work to reduce or remove existing barriers to building larger, more connected restoration projects at the right locations, particularly within the Delta. The proposed ecosystem amendment to the Delta Plan that Campbell discussed earlier seeks to advance 5 core strategies that are designed to achieve the long-term restoration vision that's set forth by the Delta Reform Act by the year 2100. That proposed amendment also includes a performance measure that identifies a long-range target of 60,000 to 80,000 acres of restoration in the Delta that I believe we'll hear Dylan expand upon in his presentation a bit later. One of those proposed core strategies is to improve institutional coordination to support implementation of ecosystem protection, restoration, and enhancement. And the proposed amendment also includes a recommendation that calls for the DPIIC to consider establishing a subcommittee represented now by the folks who are gathered today to identify and implement strategies that would reduce barriers to landscape scale restoration and would increase estuary-wide coordination. Some of the barriers that we may consider include land acquisition and long-term ownership, as well as management, securing a portfolio of funding approaches, achieving permitting efficiency, promoting adaptive management, and providing for appropriate landscape scale recreational access, among other challenging items. Given the increasing and urgent challenges to the Delta ecosystem posed by climate change and drought, we're seeking to jumpstart this coordination effort as we begin with our initial meeting today. The Stewardship Council and the Delta Conservancy have developed an initial structure for this coordination, and that's outlined here on this slide. The first component is the Ecosystem Restoration Subcommittee, this group, comprised of key staff that represent the different DPIIC member agencies and departments that have a role in ecosystem restoration in the Delta. This group will meet to prioritize restoration barrier issues and develop recommendations to the full DPIIC for priority issues that we identify. The subcommittee may also identify task forces as needed to work on specific prioritized activities that are identified by the full subcommittee. Those task forces would include participation by the subcommittee members, as well as subject matter experts from various agencies or departments. So it's within the task forces that we may branch a little beyond just the folks who are gathered today within our organizations. The task forces would meet to identify alternative solutions and to make recommendations to the subcommittee. And I believe as part of our agenda, the identification of a first task force is part of one of our objectives for today. In addition, the subcommittee will host a recurring forum for stakeholders to participate in restoration activities. These forums will provide opportunities for local agency partners and the general public to provide input on early restoration project concepts and alternatives, as well as potential good neighbor approaches, as Eric mentioned, to maximize the compatibility of restoration projects with surrounding uses. And this forum would be similar in scope and function to what some folks may have participated in, known as the Delta Restoration Network previously. Next slide, please. Initial staffing to support the subcommittee that's gathered here today is being coordinated between the Stewardship Council staff and the Delta Conservancy staff. We've also sought key staff from participating agencies to participate in our meetings, followed by these initial meetings, followed by quarterly or biannual gatherings. And I want to just take an opportunity to thank each of you for your participation today and going forward. We also anticipate that once the subcommittee is firmly established, we may seek funding from the different DPIIC member agencies to potentially hire staff or contract with a consultant to support these efforts, depending on how things go forward. With that, I'll hand it over to Campbell to discuss some of our initial thoughts on a work plan. Campbell?
Thanks, Jeff. Next slide, please. So here's really the basic concepts for what we've been thinking about for an initial work plan. First, we want to start to really identify gaps in knowledge of restoration opportunities. I think we all know that there's a lot happening out there on the landscape. So this really is an opportunity and a forum for us to really come together, see how all that fits together collectively and engage around those issues and better identify those gaps. We want to integrate efforts in the Delta Landscape Scenario Planning Tool and just other tools that are coming online that will really help us facilitate how we do planning effectively. And again, with all of our interests and agencies engaged. So we definitely want to, sorry, I got to move things around here so I can see the rest of the slide. And then it's also an opportunity really to assess the status of other efforts to tackle barriers to restoration and identify gaps. So this is where really getting to the Green Tape Initiative. What are those key issues and concerns that are thwarting our progress or slowing our progress, and how might we as a group really highlight those issues and take them to the DPIIC, hopefully a place where we might be able to resolve some of those issues and move forward more effectively and more efficiently. Next slide, please. So the timeline, we are here at the initial subcommittee meeting today. The hope is that out of this meeting that we might establish a goal setting work group. And then ultimately the expectation is that we would present the outcome from this meeting and a better sense of where the group will head in the near term to the DPIIC at their March meeting. In the spring, we would like to coordinate our initial forum that Jeff mentioned, where it would be much more broad opportunity to bring the Delta community in to help them really understand what this subcommittee intends to do, as well as maybe make presentations on the current restoration activities that are happening. Again, this is really an opportunity to engage with the community, have them better understand what's happening and provide input. I think for years we've heard repeatedly that the CEQA process, where they typically get to engage, is too late in the process to really have their information and their input have a significant effect on how projects move forward. So I think we can think about that forum as an opportunity for a two-way engagement and early coordination discussion about restoration as it's happening in the Delta. So we really look forward to providing that opportunity. Next slide. And the next slide is questions. Are there any questions?
All right, so if there are any questions or comments from subcommittee members on the presentation that Campbell and I just provided, this would be a great time. And I would ask folks who would potentially have a question to please use the raise hand feature.
No questions, Amanda? Going
I
once.
don't see any hands raised.
No
Okay.
hands raised. Okay.
All right,
And then
well-
Amanda and Brandon, are there any public comments on this?
There aren't, but just a reminder, if anyone's on the phone, *9 to raise your hand. So we'll just give them a second in case anyone on the phone is interested.
All right, thank you.
Great. So now we'll move into agenda item 3, which is restoration history and current status. And I want to introduce Dylan Chapple, who is a senior environmental scientist with the Stewardship Council. And he's going to present on previous restoration in the Delta and current efforts to catalog existing projects to help identify conceptual and physical gaps in restoration. Tools to help these gaps, such as EcoAtlas, the landscape scenario planning tool, will also be discussed. So Dylan, take it away.
Great, thanks, Campbell, Jeff, Amanda, and everybody. Really happy to be sharing this work with you today. This has been going on for a while in our unit at the council. Also, over the years, a lot of collaborative effort with Dan Constable's unit in the planning division as well. And I think it's really exciting, the timing of this, that this information is coming up right around the time that this subcommittee is getting started. And I think we certainly see the potential for a lot of overlap here. So what I'm going to be presenting on today is an in progress, nearing completion effort on synthesizing restoration outcomes in the Delta and Sassoon Marsh. Also want to just give credit to my colleague, Jenica Moffett, who is our Sea Grant State Fellow in our unit, who has also done quite a bit of the work that you will be seeing today, particularly the graphs. So next slide, Brandon. Give you a little bit of background on this project, where it came from. What it is essentially is an overview of process-based restoration to date, and as well as the future of restoration through currently identified planned projects, with the goal of informing planning of future restoration and management, including the Delta Plan restoration targets. We were already using these draft restoration targets as our main means of comparison in the paper before we even directly connected with the subcommittee, so it's very fortuitous. And we're moving ahead to answer these basic questions, but that haven't been synthesized in one place before. So what has been done to date and where? What are some of the key lessons learned from these projects? And what are the opportunities and challenges associated with implementing restoration in the system? Next slide. And this has been referred to a couple times already, but right now, as I think you're all aware by now, Chapter 4, the ecosystem chapter of the Delta, is going through an amendment process. So the proposed amendment, there's a draft target of between 60 and 80,000 total acres of process-based restoration by 2050. There's a draft EIR out, that was circulated in the fall, and so they're in process here. I'll be referring to these goals throughout my presentation. And I think it's just important for us to keep in mind that these goals were ultimately sourced from a wide range of different agency documents and plans. So this isn't something that just emerged as a part of the ecosystem amendment. It really is something that's building on the work of this really long list. Won't read the whole list, but wide variety of different groups who have identified these needs for habitat at the landscape scale. So that's what we'll be sort of comparing our progress to today. Next slide. The audience for this effort is, sort of a mix of practitioners, policymakers, and scientists. The main product that we're currently working on is a scientific paper that we'll be submitting to the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science Journal. But critically, we also expect to develop a number of associated outreach products that will communicate our findings, in a much shorter, more digestible format than many dozens of pages of more scientific writing. And then we really do hope that we are able to plug really directly into the work that the Restoration Subcommittee is doing. I think, as I hope you'll see throughout the presentation, we do see it as a real no-brainer place for us to plug our work into. So next slide. Critically, just want to mention here what's not included. So we aren't taking a detailed look at flow actions and management. While we do have text that acknowledges the importance and overlap of flow and water availability in concert with restoration, there have been a number of other efforts to look at this, including the paper down there by Ted Summer that was completed in 2020. We're not looking specifically at temperature management. Again, another really important tool in the toolkit that others are working on, but out of scope for us here, as well as direct species population management or invasive species control. So these are all aspects that we discuss qualitatively, but aren't included in sort of our more quantitative analysis. Next slide. This is another one of those, I won't read the whole list kind of slides, but this has been developed over time with input from a variety of interagency working groups that include members of, I think, most of the groups represented here. So we have gotten reviews and feedback on early concepts, outlines, some of the projects that we've done already. And then notably, everything I'm going to be presenting today is pre sort of our final review. So because it can be a challenge to track down information about restoration projects, as we found, we do feel that we've vetted this with these groups already, but we will be doing a final round of review to see if any of our information is out of date, if we missed anything. So our numbers today will be a guide, but may not be fully 100% complete, and will change a bit depending on input from these interagency groups. Next slide. In addition to working with these groups, we're also building on a long history of looking at this in the system. There's been a number of different projects over time, dating back to CalFed, the Ecosystem Restoration Program, the DRERIP conceptual model effort. All of these things are informing the way we're thinking about the system and helping us with both our qualitative and our quantitative analysis. Next slide. Lastly, we do take at least somewhat of a look at the governance and policy of the restoration system, asking the question, what are the main policy, regulatory, and so, other considerations for developing restoration projects in the Delta, touching on funding, some of this history, and also looking at permitting through the lens of, potential overlap and conflict as you move from habitat for one species to habitat to another species, for example. Next slide. So the crux of our analysis is this typology for different restoration types in the Delta that we built based on the available information. And I'll walk you through the process of acquiring that information just after these slides. But essentially, we were able to divide the landscape up into tidal wetlands up there at the top, non-tidal wetlands. Most of that acreage are freshwater wetlands that are designed for subsidence reversal purposes. And there's a handful of other ecosystem types mixed in there as well, but that's the main the main numbers of the total acreage. Riparian areas. This is pretty broad, as many of you well know. Riparian in the Delta can mean directly connected to the river system. It can also mean a riparian type habitat on a leveed island that might not have a direct connection to the river, but still provides similar functions for avian species, avian and other species in the system. And lastly, we also took a look at floodplains. And next slide. So I wanted to show then how we crosswalked this with the current Delta Plain restoration target categories, the drafts of those that are currently being developed. So tidal wetlands, very directly connected to tidal wetlands verbatim. Non-tidal wetlands encompassed seasonal wet meadow, non-tidal wetland, and alkali seasonal wetlands targets in the draft Delta Plain targets. Riparian encompassed willow, riparian, scrub, shrub, valley, foothill, riparian, and willow thicket. And then floodplain also lined up with those riparian categories. There isn't a specific category in the restoration targets for floodplain. And so, you know, this one is the least elegant crosswalk between the two of them, but more or less, we think a lot of that area can be overlapped with our floodplains. That's kind of what we see out there. And then on the far right here, we have the draft target acreages for each of them. So you'll see us return to these as well. 32,500 acres for tidal wetlands from the baseline, 19,000 acres for non-tidal wetlands, and 16,300 acres for riparian and floodplain. Next slide. So to determine what we have out there in the system, to answer this question of what is the scope of restoration that has been completed or is planned in the Delta, we used the EcoAtlas platform. Many of you are probably familiar with, but this GIS-based tool maintained by the San Francisco Estuary Institute that includes a project tracker function where project proponents put in information about their projects and update that information themselves. So, you know, this larger map that you're seeing here is clipped in GIS to the Delta and Sassoon Marsh. And we're taking a look at completed projects, which we would consider all of the initial process-based activities that were scoped in their environmental documents have been completed. Tidal wetlands provide a good example. Once the levees have been breached, we would consider that tidal wetland project completed, even if it has a while to develop its full functionality. In progress projects are projects where construction has been initiated but not completed. Planned projects have initial environmental documents with specific acreages identified, but haven't broken ground on them yet. And unintentional breaches, which we're also looking at, not quite counting towards the targets, but also really important and informative for us to consider areas like Liberty Island, where you did have this, you know, massive creation of tidal wetland, for example, that came out of an unintentional breach. And so these are areas, I think, pretty much entirely where unrepaired levee breaches established some tidal or riverine access. Next slide. So moving from EcoAtlas as our starting point, and actually you can cycle through these, Brandon. So we worked with a number of other sources to bring in projects and areas that weren't necessarily identified on EcoAtlas. And then to confirm the numbers and details, we looked through CEQA documents, Eco-Restore project info sheets, bond accountability reports, really any additional information we could find through partners or through web searches to help us augment and really hone in on what the acreage is that we were at, you know, the accuracy of the different types of acreages that we had identified. And next slide, critically, one of our next steps once we've, you know, really completed this will be to take this map that we've developed and then feed it back into EcoAtlas, which will then subsequently feed the Delta Landscape Scenario Planning tool that Campbell mentioned. And why we see this as really important is because the Landscape Scenario Planning tool allows us to take a look at the impact of restoration over the landscape, but it's only as good as the information that you give it. And so by, you know, using the information that we're developing to update that tool, then we'll ensure that any use of that tool, as well as any use of EcoAtlas for different projects, will be based on the most up-to-date data. And, you know, I think another important note here is that, of course, restoration projects will continue to come online after we finish our effort. So this won't be like a definitive end, but I think it will help us make a good deal of progress towards these sources being as up to date as possible. So next slide. And this is just a slightly bigger, but on the right, still not fully legible because of how many projects we have out there. But these are just all the different projects that we were able to identify, mapped, and divided up, into unintentional breaches, completed, in progress, planned, and then a couple small unknown ones, but mostly we were able to pin down which phase the project was in as we described it. And what you'll notice here is that this figure doesn't incorporate the full legal delta. It does cut off, and this is because south of Stockton there, and really, in that entire area, we didn't identify projects that met the criteria that we were searching with. We might identify some additional projects through our final round of outreach, but this is clearly a gap in planned restoration, is that there's not representation across the entire delta. This might be one thing to think about as the process of identifying sites for different restoration types moves forward. Next slide. So taking it all in, this is quite a bit of information here, but you can see that for unintentional breaches, that we identified 12 unintentional breaches that created over 7,600 acres of habitat. For tidal wetlands, we identified just over 6,000 acres of completed projects, just over 2,000 acres of in progress projects, and over 10,000 acres of planned projects. So this really represents the biggest chunk of restoration that we're seeing in the system. And we move on to riparian, where we have much lower numbers, but proportionally higher numbers of projects. And so I think one of the things we're really seeing is that riparian projects tend to be pursued on a smaller scale, likely usually in response to mitigating the impacts of a project, but not the large landscape scale restoration that we're kind of starting to see with tidal wetlands here. Floodplains also relatively few, but higher proportional number of projects relative to acreage. And then non-tidal wetlands, 12 completed projects totaling just a little bit above 2,500 acres, and over 1,000 acres in progress right now over three different projects. Next slide. So, I'm sorry that got a little smushed at the top there. But this is taking a look at our draft data and combining that with the draft restoration goals from the Delta plan. So if you look over on the right, this is if we take what's currently completed, in progress, and planned, and this doesn't include those unintentional breaches, just to be clear. So this is only intentionally pursued process-based restoration. So you can see that we're making a good deal of progress on tidal wetlands, and a lot of this is most of this is thanks to the eco-restore efforts, where we had this really strong motivation of the biological opinions that require these specific acreages, and we've really seen with that motivation we can get that restoration out on the landscape. And then if you look at our non-tidal wetlands goals, we're quite a bit farther behind meeting that 19,000 acre goal, as well as the riparian and floodplain. We're also, even if you take all of the completed, in progress, and planned, we're still quite a bit, pretty far away from that target as well. Next slide. So we wanted to look at, okay, well, if we take everything that is that's been done, and we look at from today in 2022 to 2050, how many acres average per year would we have to restore to reach the targets? So you can see up here, and these calculations don't include projects that are planned, and so this is only based on projects that have been completed. So including future plans for projects, we'd have to restore about 921 acres on average per year from 2022 to 2050 to meet our tidal wetland goal, about 596 acres per year from 2022 to 2050 to meet our non-tidal wetland goal, 514 acres per year to meet the riparian goal. So, I think when you break it down this way, you see that these numbers are likely attainable, but they are definitely going to require continuing to work really hard and fast, as many of you on our meeting today are, to meet the targets that are planned. And then really, I think, seems like a major goal of this group to really look ahead and identify where this next generation is going to come to fill these gaps, because our current specific planning processes really haven't identified some of these longer term projects that we're going to need to see to meet the targets. Next slide. So, a few things that we're, that we consider in the analysis for moving forward is really trying to fast track planned projects. And so things like cutting the green tape, collaborative efforts like EcoRestore, these are really great ways of trying to increase the speed of project completion. And then for the larger scale goals, really posing this question of how do we move from visions that really help us set the Delta plan, the draft Delta plan restoration targets, to actual commitments. And then how do we operationalize those commitments to reach targets? And I think to just echo back to thinking about EcoRestore and as it relates to the biological opinions, just an example where when you have a clear mandate coming from a government agency for acreage, it's a ton of work, but that lift is attainable. And I think that more community, providing more opportunities for community to weigh into restoration on the front end, which has been mentioned a couple times already in this meeting, I think is a key way to make sure that plans that you're bringing up aren't conflicting with existing uses, aren't creating issues for landowners, these sorts of things. And all of this kind of gets us at funding that might have shorter timeframes than bond funding. So how do we do that? How can we minimize the hiccups along the way? And next slide, which is I think my last slide. Some of the key gaps that we identified as they relate to the Delta Plan restoration targets. Notably, we're not currently reflecting all of the restoration activities in the synthesis. So for example, there's 13,000 acres of oak woodlands identified. We weren't able to find projects that met the criteria for oak woodland restoration. So there's not been progress towards that target. Vernal pools, we ran into a similar issue, different scale, and there has been a little bit of restoration done, but not enough to rise to a full-scale analysis, really just a few acres. Same goes for stabilized interior dune vegetation. So all of these targets here are currently gaps in current planning processes and completed projects. And then lastly, I think we really do point to climate change as happening in the background here, and a lot of the best available science for thinking about establishing process-based restoration is that the sooner you can get projects in the ground, the more effective and the more resilient they're going to be to the future impacts of climate change. And with that, I think that brings me to my question slide. So I'm happy to take any questions, and also happy to follow up about this. My email's there, so you can please feel free to contact me with any thoughts or questions.
Great. Thank you, Dylan. I think everybody can recognize how important it is for us to understand where we are relative to our targets as a baseline. I think we're all working somewhat independently on restoration throughout the Delta. So to see this all in one place, I think is really powerful and really important, and really appreciate it. I'll kick off with one question, Dylan. You mentioned, and it seems like a lot of this analysis has been done, or is very close, but you also mentioned that when the analysis is complete. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about what additional is left to be done, what the timeline for that is, and then where will the report ultimately reside, and how will it be available to people?
Yeah, no problem. So I think in a little less than a month, we plan to do a final circulation of the draft, and really having people focus on the list of projects that we've identified, letting us know if we've missed anything. really making sure that this is something, because it is a pretty, the scale and scope of this is pretty large. And so we're going to give folks probably about a 2-month window, which would put us with getting comments back in probably early April. And then we would plan on a few months to finish up and submit to the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science Journal for publication. That ensures that, it doesn't run the risk of getting taken down for, updated accessibility issues or anything. So it will just be available for, for open source viewing, through any search, particularly academic search. And then I think as we kind of work with this group and other groups to identify what our communication products will be moving forward, those will come, concurrent with the development of the paper.
Great. Cool, thanks. I also really appreciated the looking at the acreage targets into the future and acreage per year. I think it really does paint a different picture about how achievable those targets actually are. Eric, I know you had a question about the origin of the 32,000 acre target. Did you?
Yeah, really about all of those restoration acreage targets. Dylan, and by the way, great presentation, Dylan, thank you. Is it based, are the baselines going back to a particular year, or what's year 0 in terms of these restoration acreage targets? Yeah,
so what these are based on in the current draft of the ecosystem amendment is the 2007 VegCamp data. So that was like vegetation mapping from 2007. We have done, restoration since then, but since that's the kind of the baseline and where we're starting. So for example, that identified just shy of 20,000 acres of tidal wetlands that was already on the landscape then. So that, that includes Liberty Island, that includes some of these larger scale breaches that occurred. So we're kind of considering any increases post that 2007 mark to just be consistent with the update. That's what we're scoping.
Okay, and is that true in the proposed revision of the Delta plan? It's keying off of that 2007 VegCamp information?
Yeah, exactly. We just followed all of that verbatim in our development to be, the most policy relevant.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions or comments out there?
I'm seeing
Songs.
Yeah,
Has his hand up.
Yeah, so this question goes both Dylan and Jeff as well. While you were talking about the whole gold issues, could you elaborate what Jeff, for you, was the landscape level restoration, which is, I guess, represents the size of it, I guess, or what's the scope of, say, restoration that will be representing the landscape level? And Dylan, for you, it's what is the process-based restoration?
Thanks, Fasong. For the landscape-based restoration, we are talking about the size of projects, the connectivity of those projects, and the placement in, essentially, for lack of a better word, the right spot on the landscape with regard to elevation and the matching of appropriate types of restoration to the elevation characteristics and other natural characteristics of the land. So it's part size, part connectivity, and part location. And taken together, that's what we're referring to when we talk about landscape scale restoration.
So it's more conducive to the proper landscape size and location?
Yes.
And that in the Delta, that would be also related to, for my understanding of the restoration of any kind of project, it's the one connectivity issue that you talked about, how your restored landscape, restored area, or restored restoration project is connected to the other either restoration project site and or the adjoining other ecosystem let's say for the aquatic system, if it's a wetland restoration or the tidal wetland, that has to be connected to the main delta system. So that's sort of a connectivity issues, and then also how it can be accounted as in terms of it's a project's benefits in a way. So yeah, so thanks for explaining that part of the question.
And the
Dylan,
proposed amendment to the Delta plan does incorporate a new proposed policy that is essentially designed to help document those projects as they're being proposed, to document the ways in which those projects meet those various different criteria for landscape scale restoration. So that's, I think, in part something that we're hopeful will be helpful going forward in terms of, I think, Dylan and the team that are building this great foundation for our understanding of kind of where we are and where we need to go. And then we're hopeful that that implementation of that policy as new projects are coming to the council for their covered action certifications are documenting how they're meeting those various metrics, which will then allow us to take some of this work and continue to kind of track it going forward, so that in the future it's perhaps less, in the future it's easier to get a sense of not only where are we and where we need to go, but also where we came from, and the ability to kind of build that tracking going forward.
Thanks.
Yeah, and then I'm happy to take that process-based question. And because restoration looks really different depending on the ecosystem type, I think maybe it's the most appropriate for me to describe what is not process-based restoration. So what we didn't consider was preservation, so land acquisition that didn't include substantive modifications. I think that's, and as well as the unintentional breaches, we wouldn't consider that process-based restoration, because even though it may have had the outcome of creating some degree of ecologically functional habitat, there wasn't an explicit process and involvement of different knowledge that went into the design and implementation of that. And so for example, I think at its simplest, for maybe some of our our riparian restoration projects, it's were plants planted? Did you purchase and grow plants and plant them in an ecologically strategic location to achieve a particular goal? For tidal wetlands, it's did you engineer or make sure that your surface elevations were appropriate such that when a levee was breached, the tide would return in a way that would create a functional tidal wetland. So, does that help? I can specify a little more as well if needed.
Yeah, I sort of lost you for about 30 seconds while you were talking. Maybe it was my internet connection or somebody, or maybe it's from my end. So I was basically thinking the process based, when you're talking about it, it's mainly doing some physical modification as in process.
Yeah, that's a piece of it, the physical modification piece. And then, there's also sort of the dimension where those physical modifications are specifically linked to the physical processes that produce the desired ecological outcomes. So there's kind of a double, there's two layers almost to the process-based meaning in this particular context.
So one of the sort of hypothetical situation, obviously we have the through the Yolo bypass, we have a fish passage project going on, which does include the flow through the Yolo bypass, through that fish gate or the fish ladder gate, whatever you call it. And that will actually result in a little bit of inundation in different locations within the Yolo bypass. So we're not talking about the direct impact of the project, but it's sort of byproduct of project, although could be enhanced by doing some modifications in the channels, in the bypass, or the landscape itself. Could that be potentially a process-based?
Yeah, so through our conversations, that's actually like you've keyed in on sort of exactly where our probably stickiest decision point was for deciding this like particular situation where is increasing flow through an existing landscape, does that meet the criteria? And where we ended up landing for the purposes here was that unless there is a material creation of new habitat, so the name of the project is escaping me, but recent Eco-Restore project that relocated a levee that actually, materially increased the size of the floodplain. That met our criteria, but what you're describing didn't end up meeting our criteria, largely because we felt that once we opened that up, it just got a lot of other things got more complicated. And to your point precisely, we also do describe that qualitatively in our document, sort of how we made those decisions, why we made those decisions, and what the implications are, as well as pointing people to relevant resources where those types of interventions are synthesized, like the Ted Summer 2020 paper was the example that I had in the.
So I want to break in. I think this is a great discussion. I think something that will definitely continue, but got a couple more quick questions and we're running a little bit over time on this section. So I think Doug Brown, you were next.
Can you hear me?
We got you.
Great. Okay. Yeah, great presentation, really good information. I am curious how the work that you're doing, Dylan and Jeff, might relate to the conservation strategy that's been developed by the Central Valley Flood Protection Board as part of their flood plan. They identify performance measures in that conservation strategy, includes acreage and mileage measures, depending on the type of performance they're trying to achieve. And then they've struggled a bit looking at the difference between mitigation and uplift and have decided that they're focusing just on uplift. It doesn't sound like that's what you're looking at here. Are you wrestling with that same issue?
We're not looking at that for our particular effort specifically, Doug, but the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is one of the documents that was considered in the development of the targets. So in that big list that I didn't read through everything for, that is included under the umbrella of what's being considered in the ecosystem amendment.
Okay, and then mitigation measures, basically any restoration associated with mitigation counts towards these acreages. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. And we found that, whether it's large scale mitigation, like, the BIOPS acreage requirements, or very small scale, we're doing a levee improvement and there's an acre of planting, so we have that whole scale from thousands of acres to like less than an acre reflected. Okay.
And then just one last quick question is regarding the upper yellow bypass. Is that being considered as part of this, or is it because it's out of the Delta, it's really not a focus area?
Yeah, good question. Because of at least for the restoration synthesis piece, just because we really are focused on the jurisdiction of the Delta Stewardship Council, it doesn't include anything that's outside of the legal Delta boundary. It's a good question.
Okay, great, thanks.
Great.
Thank you. Looks like Deirdre Desjardins has her hand up. Deirdre?
Yeah, I just wanted to know how you're considering, just because you plant a bunch of native plants doesn't mean that that's what's going to be dominant. And I do have friends who've gone and done extensive work on river restoration projects when non-natives invaded aggressively after a restoration project. And also how you're going to incorporate adaptive management of these projects.
Yeah, great question, Deirdre. And I think what we really see this as is a first step towards a more concerted evaluation like you're talking about. Currently, we don't have in one place, all of these projects identified. And so we really see that as a first step, and hoping that then some of the subsequent steps is that this is then facilitating the ability to go out and do some of that post-project monitoring. That's out of the scope of what we're working on here. Limited staff for this project, but again, we do really see that being a critical piece, and that's something that we do tackle qualitatively in the text. Certainly, is the issue of invasive species, both from aquatic, terrestrial perspectives. But again, it was just too big a question and too site specific for us to consider in our analysis right now. We're hoping in the future it'll be possible.
Okay. I know that for Delta Conservancy projects, we asked the applicant to in great detail talk about their adaptive management plans and how they intend to address anticipated and unanticipated outcomes. So I don't see any more questions. Anybody from the public, or Amanda, did you see anybody else?
No, I think the last two were from the public, and I don't see any other hands raised.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Dylan. I do think that's just really a great presentation and just a great overview that forms the basis of, I think, everything this group will be focused on. So really appreciate that.
My pleasure. Thanks for your time, everybody.
And I think we're going to turn it over to Amanda to handle number 4, DPIIC Restoration Subcommittee Vision and Focus.
Yeah, thanks, Campbell. So we are going to do a half-hour or so interactive brainstorming session to try and kind of identify some kind of a place to start in crafting a vision and a kind of a focus and a set of goals for the subcommittee. So in your chat, I have placed, and I'm sending you all now, a link to a Jamboard, and this is a Google online Google option for doing brainstorming sessions like this. So click on that, and that should get you into, and then I think Brandon's also going to put the quick link in there as well. And we're also inviting attendees from the public to also participate in this exercise, and not just limiting it to the DPIIC Restoration Subcommittee members who are here. And so the goal of this exercise is really just to gather feedback and ideas, and not to do any kind of actual drafting of the vision or goals today. We are hoping at the end of this little brainstorming session to convene a small working group to kind of help pull all this together. But for now, we really just want to start collecting your ideas and your thoughts. So a couple of pointers here just on the Jamboard to start. So there'll be a couple of different ways to add your ideas and your thoughts to the Jamboard. The first is to click here on sticky note. I'm not sure if you can see what I'm doing here, or if a sticky note is just coming up on mine. So you'll come over here. Brandon, maybe you can do it since we're sharing your screen. So if you put your cursor over on the little box, actually just below that, the one underneath that, the sticky note, there you go. If you click on that, and then a sticky note will pop up, and you can write your thought on there, and then you hit save, and it's there. So the other way you can do this is to just respond verbally, and Rachel Wigginton is going to be capturing those comments and placing them on the Jamboard for us. And so we have, I think, 3 or I guess 4 now slides to kind of walk through with just some questions that we would like to, just kind of pick your brains on and just get some feedback on. And so first, really kind of starting at the big picture, and really trying to get at kind of what does a restored delta look like, and more specifically, or maybe this is a little bit easier way to think about this, but what are some of the qualities or characteristics of a restored delta? What to you dependent on kind of your experience in restoration, or what your agency focuses on? What are some of the things that you think would really support a restored delta? So I invite you to either start creating your own little sticky notes and putting them on the Jamboard, and they should populate once you save it on the screen that we all see. Or if you want to say something, again, Rachel will capture your thoughts, and we will put these on here. So we'll spend the next several minutes here on this first one on the qualities and characteristics of a restored delta. And so again, to you, does this have to do with flows? Does this have to do with the number of birds, or the number of fish, the types of fish, abundance, connectivity, salinity? So really kind of, again, whatever is something that is relevant to the work that you're doing in the Delta, we would really love to kind of get your thoughts on this. So, and feel free just to jump in if you have any comments or raise your hands and I will call on you. It's good to start seeing some. So resilient habitat that supports native species, connectivity, flourishing native species, built-in adaptability. And again, we are inviting attendees to participate in this too. So you should have received the link in the chat that went to everyone.
Amanda, you can also find it up here in the top corner of the screen.
Oh, that's right. Thank you. Yeah. A robust wildlife community that includes all taxa, not just fish and birds. And if you see something on here that you agree with and don't have any changes to, but really would like to emphasize that, you can also, I think, select the little pen marker here, and then you can just kind of put a check mark or a star or something that just signifies that you agree. And let us know if you're having any trouble accessing this. And you can also put your comment in the chat if that's easier for you as well. And then we can type that in. Restored Delta allows for robust aquaculture, regrowth, healthy spaces for Delta residents to have safe food, people to have a beautiful place to recreate, and a safe drinking water supply. We'll give this a couple more minutes since I still see thoughts coming in. A few people have agreed with the comment that Restored Delta meets multiple benefits for people and species. Public access for human wildlife. Okay, I think we'll give this another minute before we move to the next set of questions. And if anything comes to mind after this, feel free to send me an email or a chat and we'll make sure it gets included. And actually, you can always also go back to this Jamboard and add things even if we've moved on to the next one, since you all have access to it. Okay, well, great. Thank you all. Okay, so moving on to the second set of questions. So thinking about what we just heard from Dylan's presentation, we'd like to hear your thoughts on what additional restoration planning is needed. So again, building on, again, what we just heard from Dylan, what you know of the work the work that you do in the Delta around restoration. And, you know, we're kind of going to be asking this in a couple of different ways, and feel free to go ahead and start answering either question based on kind of what's coming to you. But, you know, what additional restoration planning is needed, at what scale and at what locations? So how small, how large, geographically, you know, and then also what tools can we use to aid in the planning process? So we've mentioned the Delta landscape scenario planning tool, EcoAtlas. Are there other tools that we can use or should be considering as we try to figure out what type of restoration planning might still be needed to help us reach our vision of a restored Delta? Or your vision of a restored Delta, I should say, since we don't have a unified vision quite yet. And I think we can also think of tools, not just in terms of like technological tools, but are there incentives we could be using? Are there things that we could use that would help that are beyond just kind of technological support? So the first comment we have in terms of scale and locations, expand on Delta conveyance. So look at restoration projects outside yet adjacent to and beneficial to the Delta. Potential tools, multi-use and multi-benefit to promote broader support. Connectivity is more important than scale, but large scale adds economic and ecological value. I think we'll give this slide another minute or two. Really appreciate the thoughtful responses. Okay, so I think we'll move to the last set of questions. But again, if other things pop into mind, feel free to come back to this one and add your comment. You can also email me or send me a chat as well. So now trying to kind of bring it down more to kind of the scope of the Restoration Subcommittee. The proposed ecosystem amendment identifies a number of different barriers to restoration, which is really why the formation of the Restoration Subcommittee is included as one of the recommendations, so that we can start to identify and work toward addressing those barriers. And some of the ones that have been identified, funding, permitting, operations and management, and then also organizational capacity and institutional capacity and barriers. So thinking about this Restoration Subcommittee, thinking about the other restoration initiatives that are currently out there, the successes they've had in the past, maybe where they're going in the future. What are the aspects of restoration that are most important for this subcommittee to focus on, and why? And in particular, really, kind of what can this subcommittee do? And what value can this collaboration, bringing together all of these agencies, what value can this collaboration add to increasing the amount of restoration that's happening in the Delta? And if there's an aspect of restoration or a barrier to restoration that we don't have listed here, please add that and explain that as well. Yeah, I think we'll give this last slide just another couple of minutes. I love this term that somebody used, network weaving, facilitating conversations and connections between actors in restoration planning and other related processes, for example, Delta adapts. Okay, so I think the Jamboard is going to remain open. So again, if an idea comes to you, please feel free to come on in and make your comment on the appropriate slide. But we're going to go on back for now to that first slide and that first question. And Rachel Wigginton is going to just maybe summarize some of the key comments, maybe share any observations that she has from kind of reading these and reading these comments and thinking about them for the last few minutes. Rachel?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for participating in that. I was the little person moving around all your sticky notes, trying to group them together. So just some key takeaways that I got from that brief exercise of everyone providing input. So a restored delta is resilient and adaptable. It provides multiple ecological values for both human and non-human communities. And it also provides public access opportunities. So that's one of those ecological values, in addition to some of the other basic ecological support that a restored estuary could provide. Going to that next slide. So when we talked about additional restoration planning, I thought there were several key themes here. So it seems like the group really thinks we need restoration planning at both the landscape scale, but then also at the sub-regional scale, especially in some areas where we know there's lots of restoration opportunity. We're looking to increase our tools for coordinating both among our different agencies that are implementing this work, but also with the public. Several tools identified of increased accuracy of our ecological models, or just creating some new ecological models to help inform our restoration work. And then also a couple different mentions of some creative funding solutions that could be part of our restoration planning efforts. Then going to that last slide, talking about some of the barriers that the Restoration Subcommittee itself could focus on. Funding again came up here. As well as the need for increased collaboration, both within agencies for things like permitting, but then also with local groups in order to get real local buy-in and support for some of our restoration plans that we're putting on the landscape. Another big thing that this subcommittee could potentially resolve, according to this group, is just the process of identifying where some of these restoration projects will go, where our biggest restoration opportunities are, and how to align that with some of the other co-equal goals that are going on in the region. And then finally, calling, I think, this group to resolve some remaining uncertainties around restoration impacts at the landscape scale. So in that kind of top right corner, I tried to consolidate some of those thoughts. So I thought that was a very effective exercise, and I appreciate everyone being so interactive on the Jamboard.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. And so now we have a few minutes left just to check and see if any of the subcommittee members have any comments they'd like to make, in addition to anything that they may have posted, or just general comments about even this process and this approach to trying to start identifying a vision and goals for the subcommittee. Okay, I don't see any participants who have comments, but I do see one member of the public, so I'll move to that. Deirdre.
Yeah, I was the one who posted about network weaving, and it's actually based partly on I have experience doing organizing and community organizing, and it's an approach that works there. But there was a specific research in Oregon about how network weaving helped a network of agencies and NGOs and local government and community groups in natural resource management. And I'd like to get you a copy of that paper, and maybe the other participants would be interested in it as well.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, Deirdre. Okay, I don't see any other hands raised. So next thing that we'd like to do is ask for a couple of volunteers to help form, oops, I see one other public comment real quick. Anitra. Looks like you're still muted, Anitra, or have we not?
Yeah, Nitra, you should be able to mute yourself.
I don't think, yeah, we still can't hear you, Anitra. I'm not sure if you're trying to talk. But if you want to type a comment in, or if you want to send it to me, I can make sure the group gets your comment.
I just figured it out.
Okay, good.
I couldn't find the box and suddenly it appeared. So my name is Anitra Polly. I work at DWR and some large scale restoration projects. This note just came up into my email, so I actually wasn't here for part of the meeting, so I apologize. But one of the things that I think that the council could help with, or a restoration subcommittee of this nature, would be focusing on sort of large scale restoration and the regulatory impediments that we have to get through. We talk about cutting the green tape, for example, but it's really difficult in some of these multi-benefit projects where we have both restoration and, for example, flood management or other sorts of management goals as well. And it's anyway, so I just think that would be a focus that this group might be able to tackle.
Great, thanks, Anitra. And I think Rachel just captured that on our Jamboard, so thank you. Okay, so next up is, as we mentioned at the beginning of this, we would really like to develop kind of a unifying vision for the subcommittee and a kind of a set of goals, at least for this first year of work. And so with all the ideas that we just collected, we would like to create a small working group to convene at least once to draft some language to then bring back to this full group to discuss in early March. And so we're looking for a couple of volunteers who will join, the council and Conservancy staff who are meeting and working on this. And so we'd love to get, 3 or 4 people to meet. We're hoping just to meet once. But we'd love some help in kind of fine tuning and kind of really pulling out the key points from all of these boards and helping us craft a vision statement and a set of goals. And again, we are hoping that the working group will meet hopefully just once over the course of February, pull something together, and then reconvene this group in early March, and then present at DPIIC the end of March. I see Bill's hand raised. Is that to say something and or to volunteer, Bill?
Yeah, I'm happy to help out. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And Kathy?
Sure, I can help out as well.
Great, thanks, Kathy. And Ivan has asked if that's available to the Buena Vista Rancheria as well, and absolutely. Be great to have your participation.
Wonderful. We'd love to help out and provide any support to agencies, and especially with that working group.
Great, thanks, Ivan. Anyone else? I think we have a good group, but if there's someone else who would like to. Anitra, I see that your hand is raised. Or is that left over? Anitra, I see that your hand is raised again. Did you want to make another comment or? Nope, and it's down. Okay. Okay, so we will be reaching out to Kathy, Ivan, and Bill after this meeting, probably with a doodle poll, and we'll get something scheduled so that we can start talking about this. So thank you all. And I will now, I think, hand it over to Jeff.
I think it's coming to me. Well, good afternoon again, everyone. Just a few closing remarks and some thoughts about our future work. First, I want to thank everyone for participating today, and particularly for those who volunteered to help out with the working group on the vision. This is a tall task and a very important one that we're very pleased that everyone has participated in looking to really work together towards some common objectives that ensure restoration of the Delta at a pace that is a pace that's set up for success and in a way that occurs in the context of the co-equal goals for the Delta, ensuring compatibility with the Delta as a place along the way. So our next meeting will be scheduled for early March. We'll be, I think, as soon as we're wrapped up here, we'll start looking at the calendar for that time frame in early March and look for a meeting invite. It sounds like our objective for that meeting, at least to begin, is to review the work of the visioning work group and see if we can't agree at that point on a common vision for our work, and then begin honing in on some of the priorities to address in the first iteration of these meetings. So with that, any last questions or public comments? All right, hearing none, I want to thank everybody again for your time this afternoon. Wrapping up just a little bit early. Please, everyone, stay safe and look forward to seeing you again in early March.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.